The Eighth Amendment has tortured women for the last 30 years.
Once you are pregnant in this country, you have no right to bodily autonomy.
We campaigned against the amendment because we didn't believe, and we still don't, that a pregnancy has equal rights to a woman.
It's estimated that every day around 10 women travel from Ireland to Britain to access safe and legal abortions.
The women of Ireland are standing up now and saying, no more, we're not going to be browbeaten and we're not going to be controlled, particularly by a church that doesn't welcome us and doesn't appreciate us.
For the Virgin Mary, 'cause she's very important to us.
I believe it's the biggest civil rights issue of this generation.
This performance group is speaking of Imelda. Imelda stands for Ireland Making England the Legal Destination for Abortion. It is a London-based direct action feminist collective.
I got involved with Imelda from the very beginning. I was absolutely astounded by the panache, the youthfulness and the verve of these young women who were doing things differently.
Welcome to England Enda, where 12 women a day come to access safe and legal abortion.
We had a knicker campaign, repeal the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution, written on knickers, and 2 women from the group dropped knickers on the plate of the then Prime Minister, the Taoiseach of Ireland, who was at a dinner, a fundraising dinner for his party in North London. The Taoiseach being cut out like that was for everyone who was pro-choice, and with a sense of humour, it was a big coup.
Speaking of Imelda has been touring parts of Ireland to encourage people to vote to change the country's abortion laws.
This was a cultural group, and I always knew that this was something that would break into people's psyche and be able to penetrate this incredibly serious question and almost an unspeakable question for many.
It was not unspeakable for Ann Rossiter. Some women, like her, have been fighting for a change in the law for 40 years.
The significance of the red in the clothing is that it has this historical link with us wearing identifiable clothing when we were picking women up from the airport or from train stations. Red was quite common, you know, a red scarf or a red hat or a red something or another, and there was a long red skirt that did the rounds. The waistband had to be very expandable because we ranged from very thin women to very large types like myself. So we had a nappy pin to hold the waistband.
Tens of thousands of women have left Ireland to have terminations in Britain. They feared social stigma and were unsure about how to access trusted services. In many cases, they were also alone and needed help. For those who had no one to turn to, a group of women based in London offered care and compassion.
There was a lot of travelling across the Irish Sea for legal abortions after the 67 Act.
In the early days, we got phone calls from the Well Women's Centre and the Irish Women's Counselling Centre in Dublin, and that was quite straightforward because we had relationships with those 2 organisations. But then when the amendment which made it illegal to give out any information about abortion, those 2 organisations were forbidden to give out that information. So we had to operate a bit underground, and we called ourselves Imelda.
My early experiences, my memories of hosting are of being very, very tentative. Really, I didn't know what I was doing, but that would have gone for everybody. I can remember the early experiences, including picking 2 women up from the airport who were detained under the Prevention of Terrorism Act. One being a mother and her daughter, who was very young. It seemed to me that she was about 14 or 15. They were allowed to make 1 phone call and they had the IWAS number, and I happened to be the person on call that week. And I went out to Heathrow pronto and got in touch with the airport police, and try to make a case for them to ring the clinic, which they had so far refused to do, to ensure that it was bona fide that they had come for an abortion. Finally, the two women were released from custody to me. And you can imagine what the situation like that how terrified they both were, mother and daughter, after that. And I was also terrified, but I couldn't possibly let on that I was. I had to behave like someone who kind of does this thing for a job, more or less. It was really mind-boggling, and I can remember every detail of it. And especially since both were loyalist women and Protestants, and even though I don't have any religion at all, I would automatically be assumed to be a Catholic and possibly a Republican. But listen here, for once in their life, they were rescued by the other side.
We had one woman with 2 children, and one child was really unsettled for the whole time her mother was away. So between us, we walked the floor with the child and tried to distract her. And it was hard because we knew there was nothing we could do, but it was also hard to see a child who was distressed.
The women who came for abortions were all sorts. There is this notion that there is the typical silly teenager who just doesn't know one end of her body from the other and sleeps around. That wasn't at all true. The most typical woman that I have been putting up were women who already have children and who are in their 20s or even a little bit older.
Over the past 30 years, there have been several high-profile cases that nearly prompted a change. In 1991, Miss X, a 14-year-old girl, was raped and became pregnant. She threatened suicide if the pregnancy continued, but the state attempted to block her from travelling for an abortion on the ground that it was unconstitutional. But it's a recent case which has stirred up one of Ireland's most divisive issues.
The case of Savita Halappanavar was just one too many of her being prevented from having an abortion despite her pleas to have one in Galway University Hospital because the fetal heartbeat was still present, even though she clearly was miscarrying, and that the longer the miscarriage was allowed to progress, that the danger of her getting septicemia was imminent. And of course that is what happened, and she died from septicemia. It affected us terribly, particularly, I suppose, because she was a migrant woman. She and her husband were absolutely determined to for her to have an abortion. But again, the medical authorities intervened and refused. In fact, the whole world got to know about the case and everybody was horrified. I think they didn't believe that in a place like Ireland, such a thing, you know, in northwestern Europe, that such a thing could happen. Her death and the circumstances of her death has been one of the major impacts on the way in which young people say never ever again, now that the referendum to repeal the Eighth Amendment has got so much support.
Those people who think that the Eighth Amendment is stopping abortion, I would just like them to know that it's not. It never has. The abortion rate amongst people who come from Ireland is substantially the same as that of England and Wales. There isn't any way that that's going to lead to loads of abortions. All it's going to do, really, is allow people to have the health services that they need at home. But I really would like any of those people who still believe those silly posters that tell them that somehow the Eighth Amendment stops abortion. It doesn't. It just makes people's lives harder.
If this one actually gets carried, I won't have anything to do in life other than housework.
The time to repeal the Eighth Amendment.
Can you imagine a whole life doing this work and suddenly it's gone, you're not needed anymore? Will I be bereft? I don't think so. So, delighted to retire.